Hello everyone and welcome back to a new video. Today we'll be talking about all the books I read in the month of November, and it is also the first video for BOOKMAS 2024. I am so excited for BOOKMAS. I'm really excited for all the videos that will be coming out this month. And when I posted the announcement as a community post, I did mention that the plan was to upload a video every third day starting December 1st. But I have gotten a lot of pre-filming done, and just with the number of videos that I wanted to share, it does work out to a video every other day from December 1st to the very end of December. So I'm very excited for each video that is going to come out, and I thought I'd start off the month with sharing all the books I read in November. I am filming this a few days before the end of the month, so there are a couple of books that I have yet to finish and was hoping to finish by the end of November. I don't know that I will, but regardless, I will talk about those books sometime in December once I have finished them. But we're just going to dive right in. I'll quickly mention the books I'm currently reading, and then we'll go over what I finished in November. I'm currently reading The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare. It's been quite a while since I've read a Shakespeare play, and I'm really enjoying it. I'm about halfway through, and I do think I will finish this by November 30th. I do have a few more days in the month, so I'll try to get this done by then. And I'm really enjoying it, although it is a really strange play. I don't really know what to make of it, but I am really enjoying learning more about the main characters, Bassiano and Shylock in particular. And Jessica, Shylock's daughter, is also a really fascinating character, and of course Antonio as well. But there's just so much going on in so few pages, and I'm just kind of trying to understand all the characters' motivations and everything. It's a really interesting play looking at Christianity versus Judaism, at the hypocrisy on both sides, and I'm really enjoying it. So once I finished it, I will share more thoughts. I'm also currently reading Further Chronicles of Avonlea by Ella Montgomery, and I am almost finished with it. And I did enjoy the first few stories a lot more than some of the later ones, but I am overall enjoying it, and Ella Montgomery's writing is wonderful. I'm also reading The Christmas Hirelings by Mary Elizabeth Braddon, and I'm about halfway through that. I'm physically reading while listening to the audiobook narrated by Richard Armitage, and it is so festive and wholesome and heartwarming, and I'm loving it so much. And then I'm in the middle of a fourth book as well, and that is The Frozen River by Ariel Lawhon, and I'm about halfway through this one. Buddy reading it with Amanda, although she has finished. I'm really slow with this one. I'm just savoring every page. I honestly think this will be within my top 5 of the year. It is amazing. I'm loving it so much, and I can't wait to gush all about it once I have finished. So we'll talk about the books that I finished in November. There are 8 books to get through. 2 of them were carryovers from Victober. I didn't get a chance to finish them in October, so I finished them towards the beginning of November, and I will talk about all the books from my least favorite to my favorite like I usually do. I will say though, the least favorite I still really enjoyed. So none of the books I'm going to talk about were misses or duds at all. I had a great reading month in November, and although I'm not huge on numerical ratings, I do find them very useful for Goodreads. So 2 of the books were 3.5 stars. I still very much enjoyed them, and then the rest were 4 to 5 stars, and I'm really glad with that. So at the very bottom of the list, we have No Name by Wilkie Collins. Even though it was my least favorite read of the month, I still enjoyed it. I thought it was a great book. I just didn't fully connect to the story, the characters, all of that. But we have 2 sisters, Magdalene and Nora, and both of their parents pass away, and they're left with no money because their parents were never actually married when they were born. So the story is all about illegitimacy and inheritance and everything like that. So Magdalene and Nora are left with basically nothing. And the story is really about Magdalene seeking revenge on the family members that get all of her father's money after he passes away, and Nora becomes a governess to try to make ends meet. And the majority of the story is Magdalene's perspective and what she gets up to, all of that. And I just didn't really like Magdalene all that much. And I wish we got more from Nora's perspective, as well as their governess, Mrs. Garth. I found her really interesting. But the majority of the story after the parents pass away is Magdalene, and she runs away from home, and she meets this really odd and eccentric couple, Mr. and Mrs. Reg. And Mr. Reg was probably my favorite character in this entire book. I thought he was so interesting, and his character arc was also really great. I really loved seeing how he changed and how his attitude towards Magdalene changed throughout the story as well. I really enjoyed that. One thing I found really interesting about Margaret's story though had to do with how amazing she is at disguise and dressing up as different people and people of all ages, dressing up as men. Like, she was amazing, and she used that to her advantage, and Mr. Reg also used that to his advantage. And that was a really, really interesting part of the plot, and that just made for some really, really interesting, intense moments as well. We also meet Mr. Noel Vanston, who is a member of the family, and he has a housekeeper, Mrs. Lecount. She reminded me a lot of Count Fosco from The Woman in White, quite a bit actually. Mrs. Lecount was kind of the main villain of the story, and it was good. I thought it was good. I just wish we got more of Nora as she works as a governess. This was all about Magdalene, all about her revenge arc, and I don't like revenge stories all that much. It's why I struggled with books like The Count of Monte Cristo, and it's just not something I enjoy personally. I loved the first 100 pages, just getting to know Magdalene and Nora and their parents, and it felt very cozy and domestic. I like that there are letters throughout the story as well between different characters, between lawyers and the main characters, just adding a nice little element to the book. So it's not just straight up prose from one character's perspective the entire way through. I like books like that kind of play with form. But I just wanted more of Nora. I wanted more of Mrs. Garth. There was a plot line started with Magdalene and a young gentleman, and that kind of went nowhere. And then a romance is introduced towards the end of the story, which was really unnecessary in my opinion. That's just my opinion. I could have done without. I don't think it was necessary for the story at all. Magdalene did remind me a lot of Jo March from Little Women, and even so, I still really struggled to connect to her. I just could not connect to her. I didn't really like her. And again, it's a me problem. I know a lot of people consider this book to be one of Wilkie Collins's best and their favorite by him. I just wish things were done a little differently, and I think I would have loved this book if they were, but either way, that is No Name. Next up, we have Death Around the Bend by T.E. Kinsey. This is book 3 in the Lady Hardcastle mystery series. I did enjoy the first 2 books just a little more than this one. This one was good. I just found the first half to be very, very slow, but by the second half, things really picked up, and it was a very fun mystery, a very fun concept. In this one, Lady Hardcastle and her maid Flo are invited to this manor, and they are having automobile races there, and someone ends up dead, and it's determined that it was murder. The car was actually sabotaged on purpose, and as Lady Hardcastle and Flo do, they investigate, and the story goes from there. I love the upstairs downstairs aspect to this series. We get a lot of what goes on downstairs because of course Flo is a maid, so she gets to do a lot of investigating below stairs, and Lady Hardcastle of course investigates the upper class gentry above stairs. I also just adore Emily Hardcastle and Flo's friendship. It is beautiful. It's more like a sisterhood, and one thing that I am kind of annoyed with is that they keep referring to things in their past and spy missions they went on for the crown, and they keep referring to these things, but we're not getting a lot of detail. And I really hope that we learn more about what they did in their past before settling down in the countryside to live a quiet life. I want to know more about what went on in their past. And if any of you have read later books in the series, let me know if that happens, because I am so curious, and the author keeps hinting at all of these adventures that they got up to, and so far nothing on page. The dialogue is fantastic. The wit and the dry British humor is just perfect. I love it so much. There's just so much sarcastic banter between Emily and Flo, and it's the best. I so enjoy the dialogue in this series. So although it's not my favorite of the first 3 books, I still very much enjoyed it, and of course I'm very excited to continue the series. And there is a novella that I will be talking about just a little later in the video that I also read in this series and adored, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Next up is the second Victober carryover, and that is How to Be a Victorian by Ruth Goodman. This was a really fun read. I would say it's like a 4-star read. It's not a favorite nonfiction, but very enjoyable, and I'm so glad I read it, and I know it's one that I will want to reread in the future. This book was full to the brim with fascinating details about the life of your average Victorian, which, what does an average Victorian even mean? Because the class differences were so big, and what the author did a great job of is discussing the various topics within the context of the different classes as best as she could without making this book hundreds of pages longer than it is. The author starts the book off discussing waking up in a Victorian household and ends the book with what happens in the bedroom. So it's from sun up to sundown. And I think she did just a fantastic job at going into what waking up in the morning looked like, what eating breakfast looked like, getting dressed, all of that, and then the work day for the Victorians who had to work. But for those who didn't have to work, what did their afternoon look like, and then dinner time, and if you had to change outfits for dinner, what that looked like, using the bathroom, taking baths, Victorian medicine, like so many different topics. And she did such a great job at being very detailed, but also very concise, and then mentioning the slight differences in those topics depending on the class you were in. I wasn't sure going into this if it would be a book more about the upper class and what their day-to-day looked like, what their daily routine looked like, but I'm really glad she emphasized what life was like for the middle and working class as well, and it was very, very interesting. What I also found really, really interesting about Ruth Goodman herself is she has done and tested and lived out a lot of the things that she covers in this book. She experimented a lot. She wore the different corsets. She took care of her skin the way Victorian women took care of their skin. She followed different Victorian hygiene practices for several weeks to see how things would be, in the long term, and she really lived like a Victorian. A lot of this is her firsthand experience. I will say the last chapter deals a little bit on Victorian sexuality, and I was just a little bit uncomfortable reading that chapter, and it may put some people off, but other than that, this book was really, really great. You can feel her passion through the pages, and it's such a worthwhile read if you are interested in the Victorian era. Next up is The Mobster's Daughter by Rachel Scott McDaniel. This one is a Christian historical fiction set in the 1920s in Pittsburgh. And our main character, Kate, she is the daughter of a crime boss, but she has to keep this hidden from those around her. She doesn't want people knowing that she's linked to this huge gang of criminals within Pittsburgh. And she's actually trying to find her father as well. She spent the majority of her life in Italy and had recently moved to America. But Kate receives a very threatening letter that seems to be evidence that her life is at risk, and it has to do with her father. And this private investigator, Rhett, is tasked with protecting Kate. But things are further complicated because Rhett believes that Kate's father was responsible for his father's death. Rhett does not know Kate's true identity, and while she's trying to figure out what happened to her father, he's hunting for justice, and things get very complicated. In order to protect her, Rhett decides that pretending to date her is the best thing. So there's that fake dating trope, which isn't always my favorite, but what I really liked is the 1920s Pittsburgh setting. The book kind of had like dark noir vibes, and I did enjoy that. It felt very gritty. There's a great sense of place and time. The author has a great writing style, and I also really liked the music themes in this book. The main character, Kate, does work for a radio broadcast, and she sings and plays music, and I really, really enjoyed that. I thought the faith elements were also well done. It's a great Christian fiction. What brought it down and prevented me from really, really loving it is just the fact that it is in first person. With historical fiction, I definitely prefer third person. It's just a personal preference. I found it interesting though that it was only Kate's perspective. We do get Rhett's perspective as well, but his is in third person, Kate's is in first. And I'm just not sure that is for me personally. I did mention that it's pretty gritty, and there's that whole mobster side to the story. I do wish we got a little bit more of that and less of the romance between Kate and Rhett. The story definitely felt like it's a romance with the backdrop of Pittsburgh and the mobster world and all of that. But my personal preference is the romance to kind of take, a backseat while everything else is going on. It's just a personal preference. But besides those few things, I did really, really enjoy this. I think it's a great historical fiction and would like to read more from Rachel Scott McDaniel. She's one of the few authors I've read whose books takes place in the 20s, and you get the 20s vibes pretty strong. I really like that. So that is The Mobster's Daughter. Next up, we have Among the Mad by Jacqueline Winspear. This is book 6 in the Maisie Dobbs series and one of my favorites in the series for sure. The Maisie Dobbs series is set between the two wars, between World War I and II. And our main character, Maisie, is a private investigator, psychologist, and she's tasked with solving many different mysteries throughout the series. And this one opens on Christmas Eve with a suicide bomber, and that is a huge trigger warning for this book. The suicide bomber, mental health, asylums, all of that. PTSD, it's pretty dark. Maisie actually witnessed the death, and that was very, very difficult. But the following day, the Prime Minister receives a letter, and this letter is basically a threat to cause a huge, huge loss of life, cause a huge death toll if certain demands are not met. And the writer mentions Maisie's name. And so Maisie is brought into this investigation. She realizes very soon that there are connections to the suicide bomber. Maisie is also working with the special branch of Scotland Yard as well on this case, and it's very complicated, very layered, and it's kind of like a race against time type of story as well, which I very much enjoy. And a lot of the themes go back to World War I and the lingering effects of that war on Great Britain, on the world. And I don't want to spoil too much, but one of the main characters, Billy Beale, is also really struggling with grief. and his wife is really, really struggling, and we get a little bit into mental health treatment at the time. And that's definitely a big trigger warning. There's mentions of death of a child as well. There were parts of this book that brought tears to my eyes. Like it was intense. It was a hard read, a very, very difficult read emotionally, quite dark, not a festive Christmas read at all, even though it's set around the Christmas season. But I loved it. It was so, so good. And I love Maisie Dobbs. I love the series. I can't wait to continue. The last 3 stories, I cannot decide which one is my favorite. So they're all amazing. I loved all of them. But I'll next talk about the novella in the Lady Hardcastle mystery series that I had mentioned earlier, and that is Christmas at the Grange. And Lady Hardcastle and Flo are invited to spend Christmas in the home of the Farley Strouds, which are some really, really fun side characters in the series. I love them so much. And this book was just Christmas festivities galore. I loved it. It was so fun, so festive. And of course there is a mystery, but it is not a murder this time. This time it is theft, and a very expensive piece of jewelry goes missing. It's like a locked room mystery in that sense, because there are multiple guests that are at the house for Christmas, and there are so many different possible suspects, and Lady Hardcastle and Flo are doing their best at trying to solve this mystery. And there is such a fun twist at the end that I was not expecting, but I loved it so much. And as much as I loved the mystery, it was the Christmas atmosphere that made the story a perfect 5-star read. I loved it so much. It's a really quick read. You can easily read it in one sitting. And I just love the series so much. I love the Edwardian era. I love it so much. And then we have 2 more books to talk about. I don't know which one I love more. I love them both for very different reasons. They're very different books. Autumn by the Sea, it's a contemporary Christian romance. Who am I? I don't like Christian contemporary all that much, but here we are. And The Vanderbeekers of 141st Street by Karina Glaser. Also 5 stars, also incredible. Middle grade, Christmas. Very different than this book, but I loved them both. I don't know which one to start with. I guess we'll talk about The Vanderbeekers, as I just talked about a Christmas read, and this one was also very Christmassy. I loved this book so much. This was such a precious story of this family living in this brownstone in Harlem, and their curmudgeonly landlord decides just before Christmas that he's not going to renew their lease. He is fed up with them, their noise. It's 5 young kids under the age of 12. And so these 5 siblings decide that they are going to do everything in their power to change the Biederman, that's the landlord. They're going to change the Biederman's mind. They're going to do everything that they can. Bake him cookies, play music for him, gift him with various things. They even start a petition and get people to sign it, and it's just so wholesome. I loved this book. I keep thinking about it, especially the kids, Hyacinth, Issa, Jesse, Oliver, and Lainey, and I just love them so much. They're so precious. I'm the oldest of 5 kids, and a lot of the little shenanigans that these kids got up to reminded me so much of my childhood and all the things that my siblings and I did. I do feel like the family unit is slightly romanticized in this book, but I don't even care. It's perfect in my eyes. What made this story is how much this family clings to each other, and how much they love each other, and how much they love their home and they love their neighbors, and there's a lot of sentimentality about that, and they love Christmas, and Christmas is just around the corner, and they're hoping for a Christmas miracle, and it's just wholesome. It's wholesome, and I loved it. I was here for every minute of it. The grumpy landlord, the Biederman, was also a really interesting character, and we learn a bit more about him, and there were some difficult topics discussed in this book as well, like grief and loss of family members. And the ending also may have brought a tear to my eye. There is a little bit of preteen drama as well, as 2 of the characters are 12-year-olds. They're twins, and even though that usually bothers me, I didn't even care. I loved every single character in this book. I adored this. So I guess we're ending off the video with Autumn by the Sea by Melissa Tagg. It is the first book in a trilogy called the Muir Harbor trilogy. Is it Muir? Am I saying that right? That's how I've been saying it in my head this entire time, so I'm going with Muir Harbor. Anyways, 5 stars. Well, more like 4.5, because there were certain things that kind of brought it down, and so like I tried to be a little more objective, but subjectively, this book was perfect. And so the story opens with our main character, Sydney, and she is followed home by this guy who ends up being a private investigator, and he tells her that she may have a grandmother. She's dealt with abandonment throughout her life, went through the foster system, and so when she's told this, she kind of jumps at a chance to meet possible family. And so this private investigator takes Sydney to this farm in Maine, and she meets a woman named Maggie, along with her 3 children who are not actually biologically hers, but they are her children. And of course, there's more investigating to do. They don't know for certain if she is Maggie's granddaughter, but that storyline kind of goes from there. And then we have Neil, who is one of the 3 kids that Maggie has taken in as her own. And he's working really, really hard. The farm is struggling financially and he's trying to keep everything going. Some mysterious things have also been happening and he feels someone is trying to maybe sabotage the farm and force him to sell, and he's very, very concerned. Neil is also concerned for Maggie because there have been many different girls coming to the farm as her possible long-lost granddaughters, and he just doesn't want Maggie to continue to be hurt, and so he's just suspicious of Sydney. The story really is about Neil and Sydney's relationship. It's kind of obvious even when you read the summary on the back that it is their story, their romance, but the way that the romance develops is beautiful, and I loved every aspect of it. For me, what made this story so beautiful was not only their love story, I thought it was beautiful, but the found family aspect. I loved Maggie. I loved Neil and his sisters Indy and Lillian as well. There was so much more depth to this than I was expecting. I was actually really hesitant to pick this up. I was going to read it last fall and just never did, and then I picked it up on Kindle and I just couldn't stop. It was amazing and I had to buy a physical copy. The setting was also beautiful. I want to live on a blueberry farm in Maine. It's one of those books that made me want to just pack my suitcase and book a one-way flight to Maine and yeah, just live on a blueberry farm. Going back to the romance, I really, really appreciated the way that Sydney and Neil spoke like adults. They had conversations like grown adults. I didn't find any immaturity in their relationship at all, and I really, really appreciated how that was portrayed. Maggie as well was just full of wisdom and so much love for those around her, and I loved her character so much. There are mysteries and unanswered questions in this book, and I know that we're gonna get even more in books 2 and 3, and I cannot wait to continue this series. I will say there is a little bit of the Hallmark vibe to this story, just a little bit, which I cannot bring myself to watch Hallmark movies anymore, and I don't like books that feel Hallmarky, but this one is a huge exception, especially because of all the depth. I loved this book so much, but that is Autumn by the Sea. A wonderful contemporary story. I cannot believe I loved a contemporary story as much as I loved this, but very excited to continue the series. This was so great. So friends, those are the books I finished in November and the few books that I need to hurry up and finish because I want to get to all the Christmas reads in December. If you've read any of the books I've talked about in this video, please let me know in the comments what your thoughts were. And thank you all so much for watching this video. It means the world to me that there are so many of you that want to watch my videos. It really means a lot. It makes my heart so happy. I'm so thankful for each and every one of you. But that is it for this video, friends. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next Bookmas video. Bye.